The Three Witches of SpeelMan's Forest. Cofimvaba. Author, Brenda Wardle. Chapter 1. The Drive to Somo. It was June 1976, when Nunu and members of her immediate family were headed towards Malubini, a village in Somo, in a rural part of the Eastern Cape province. Nunu was in Standard 8 at John Bissaka Senior Secondary School in East London, and the news of her grandmother, Dorothy's passing, had hit the entire family, like a punch to the gut. Nunu was in the company of her mother, Mandix, her father, Robert, who was the one driving on the day, as well as her younger sister, Nuku. Following him, in another of her dad's cars, was her aunt Lumka, her 3 children, Mandla, Bulelwa and Barakas, and that vehicle was being driven by their uncle, Jomo. Chapter 2. The Convoy. They drove in the direction of the Transkei, from their home in Parkridge, East London. Initially, 4 cars were set to drive in the convoy to pay respects to the fallen tree. The others were Nunu's uncle, Claude, as well as a close family friend and homeboy of their father, one Mr. Dryden. However, pressing emergencies had been reported and their planned trips were cancelled all of a sudden. Of a convoy of 2 cars only, it was. Chapter 3. The Great K River Bridge. Approximately 45 minutes to an hour after they had departed from East London, the family crossed over a bridge which straddled the historical Great River, the K. And, as soon as they had done so, they entered the territory known as the Transkei, trans the K or across the K, as Nunu's Standard 5 teacher, Mr. Aiken, would normally say. This was a road travelled daily by Nunu's dad, Robert. As a result, no one even batted an eyelid when Robert decided to up the speed and fly. As Robert did so, he negotiated the hairpin bends of the K cuttings like a pro. Both Nunu and her baby sister, Nuku, were accustomed to their father's penchant for driving at breakneck speed. In fact, they were so comfortable, their mother Mandix would sometimes prefer reading, for, notwithstanding the speed at which the vehicle traveled, they were not uncomfortable at all. Chapter 4. The K Cuttings. However, for Mandix, this was no day for leisurely reading in the car. She was so engrossed in her own thoughts and so enveloped in deep sorrow and pain, that she did not even notice that her husband was driving at a high speed. Dorothy, during her life, had been known as a chronic high blood pressure sufferer, and on the morning of her passing, family members discovered that she had suffered a massive stroke. The funeral could not have come at a worse time, as Robert's wealth had begun to dwindle. People, some friends, and others, employees, had taken Robert for a ride, so he had essentially been swindled. Chapter 5. The Dirt Road. As they neared the small town of Butterworth, they took a left turn onto a dirt road at Indabakazi. They were now close to Somo. Robert, who was always snazzily dressed, looked dapper in his brown tee and expensive pair of trousers. These clothing items had been purchased from his 2 favorite shops, Bryant's and Hepworth's. The atmosphere in the car was uncomfortably intense, over and above being somberly quiet. The dust from the dirt road reduced visibility and Robert slowed down. It became easier even for Jomo, whom they had left far behind, to catch up with them. Chapter 6. Nuku suffers an asthma attack. Nuku, who suffered from asthma, struggled when they traveled on dusty roads. Her asthma pump had to be taken out from where it had been placed, between the folds of her mother's bag. When they passed SpeelMan's forest on the right-hand side, Nunu asked Mandix questions about this forest which had reached notoriety for its coven of witches, together with the sorcery and witchcraft they are said to have practiced. Chapter 7. Somo Town. As their car passed through the small town of Somo, the mood in the car lifted somewhat, with Mandix pointing to Somo Senior Secondary School on their immediate left. She told her family that that was where she had gone to school. Nuku looked at the dreary building and her forehead broke out in a questioning frown. When they reached the T-junction at 40, Robert turned right onto the tar road leading to his wife's parental home in the village of Malubini. Nuku and Nunu could breathe again and they started slapping the palms of their hands together, leading to Robert reprimanding them for being naughty. Chapter 8. Kublatoni. Nunu smiled as they passed the familiar landmark of Kublatoni on their left. It was an underground spring from which children from the area would be sent to collect ice-cold, mineral water. They took the final short turn towards the right, onto a muddy road with deep crevices and ditches in places. The children, many of whom were cousins to Nunu and Nuku, came out in their numbers, running towards the car. They abandoned the pond where they had been busy playing with the frogs and toads. Robert caught up with a black limousine, which doubled up as a hearse for funerals. It was driven by a man with a highly strung and constricted face, wearing gold-rimmed glasses. He donned a purple attire, with his white gloves clasping the steering wheel. Here, in the rural areas, Robert knew that there were no incidents of undertakers who surreptitiously returned to the graveyard at night, to raid tombs and to steal expensive coffins and caskets. Chapter 9. The Elders in the Corner. Nunu noticed her grandfather and other male elders gathered towards the corner of the homestead, near the weathered, wooden crosses of relatives who had been buried in the family cemetery. One grave was agape, with the rich, alluvial soil, stacked up on a heap towards the side. Younger males in overalls and gumboots stood perspiring, no doubt waiting for the closure of the grave after the burial. As Mandix alighted from the car, Nunu noticed her already puffy eyes swell with tears as she, undoubtedly, considered her grave loss. Mandix sought out her eldest sister, Ellen, and thereafter she headed straight to comfort her grieving father. When Nunu turned around, she was lifted from the ground and tickled pink by her uncle, Boat Stutwana, her mother's youngest brother. Her mom's eldest brother, Exoviaza, had Nuku on the back of his neck, and she was bobbing and giggling simultaneously. Sarjanageni, their favorite cousin, was hovering around, hands still muddy from the pond, his slanty eyes narrowed in a loving and excited smile. Jomo pulled into the yard and Lumka and her children also alighted and entered the gable in the far corner, where elderly women were gathered inside. Chapter 10. The Methodist Church. Robert was very fond of Sarjanageni, but today, there was no time to swirl him around in giant circles in the air. Soon after their arrival, the procession left for the corrugated iron structure behind Ngatiana's shop, which was the Methodist church where Nunu's grandmother was a parishioner and a well-respected member of the women's Manano. Zegwana Fanani, an uncle to Nunu, was playing the organ beautifully. It was hot inside the structure, but here, people appeared oblivious even to the sun's glare. After the service at the church, the mourners returned to the homestead. At the entrance were enamel wash basins half filled with water into which succulent cuttings of aloe were immersed. Robert put his vehicle, which was parked near this entrance, into gear, so as to move it out of the way. 2 white, brand new terry cloth napkins had been stuck into rusty nails jutting out from a collapsing, holed perimeter wire fence. This is where the mourners would wash and dry their hands, after the beloved Dorothy had been laid to rest. A flag was blowing in the mild winter air, white, adorned with an embroidered Methodist church crest. Chapter 11. The Burial. None of the grandchildren were allowed near the family cemetery. Nuku, Bulelwa and Nunu were playing in the shade with different groups of cousins. Scones, which had been baked, were being packed on plastic trays by the dozens. Cold rainwater from the tank had been used to prepare Nunu's favorite drink, Oros orange squash. Meat, rice, a cabbage and spinach medley, as well as pumpkin, had been cooked in giant, cast-iron pots. Then, in the corner of her eye, Nunu spotted a stout lady wheeling out a rickety and wobbly wheelbarrow in a rush. It was filled with tastic rice, sugar, cake flour and clumps of raw meat. When this woman noticed that Nunu had spotted her, she beckoned Nunu as though she was attempting to quash her guilty conscience. Nunu was just about to alert her mother, who had been crying behind one of the rendezvous, but she decided not to, and went to the elderly woman instead. Chapter 12. Nunu is poisoned. When the old woman returned, she carried a yellow enamel mug in her hand. She approached Nunu with a silly grin and asked her to down the oros. Nunu had just swallowed the first gulp when she started vomiting violently onto the loose, absorbent sand in front of her. The old lady disappeared soon thereafter. Other children noticed Nunu bent over. Her eyes were rolling, and some thought she too, like her grandmother, would die. Children screamed out for their parents and Robert dashed to Nunu's aid. Sergeant Ageni pointed to the woman, Makazi, labeling her the witch who intended to kill Nunu. Around the corner, came a young relative crying out for Buvu. Makazi had been accosted and Robert and Nunu's aunts forced her to the back of the yard, behind the horses' stables. The day was turning out to be like a story from a cruel fable. Nunu recovered and Mandix would not let her out of her sight. Chapter 13. The trip back to East London. Just before sunset, Mandix and Robert bade farewell to the rest of the family. They were concerned about Nunu and wanted her checked out at the local hospital. Her parents still shuddered from what almost turned out to be a calamity. Nunu and Nuku hugged their grandfather lovingly and bade farewell to Sergeant Ageni and all the others. Their grandfather was still concerned about Nunu's health and was honestly fearful. Both Nunu and Nuku fell off to sleep shortly after they passed Kublatoni. When Nunu woke up, they were back on the gravel road, a few meters from SpeelMan's forest. Unaware that Nunu was awake, Robert asked Mandix whether it was true that there was a coven of witches who dwelled in the forest and who, at midnight chorus. Chapter 14. The Man in the Basement. Mandix then confirmed that she had heard many a sordid tale about this forest in Cofimvaba when she was at boarding school. She confirmed that rumor had it that there was indeed a coven of witches, and that the three eldest ones resided deep in the forest. Apparently, around the time of the arrival of the 1820 settlers, the vast forest, including surrounding land, had been owned by one Mr. SpeelMan. He built an expansive house on this pristine rural site, which was situated on a nature reserve. His residence was a sturdy, red brick structure. It had many fireplaces, given the cool temperature from the tall trees and frequent rains in the dense forest. In the basement of SpeelMan's home, was a library with shelves of books as Mr. SpeelMan was rumored to have had a keen interest in witchcraft and sorcery. Chapter 15. SpeelMan was cruel to his staff. Mandix continued, telling Robert that SpeelMan was notorious for ill-treating his employees. None of them were allowed into the basement, where he spent most of his days. However, one day, disaster struck and SpeelMan suffered a heart attack. His wife rushed to call the staff to help lift his heavy frame. SpeelMan was hurried to hospital, and when the ambulance from the Cape Provincial Administration arrived, his wife, who was distraught, joined him in the back of the ambulance together with two paramedics who tried to resuscitate him as the ambulance sped away. The employees made horrific finds, and as word spread like wildfire throughout the estate and the nearby villages, more and more people gathered on the property with curious staff, congregated in the basement. The following morning there was an article in the daily newspaper, that an ambulance carrying Mr. SpeelMan and his wife, Pearl, had veered off a cliff, killing only Mr. SpeelMan and the wife. The bodies were found charred and convoluted, with the eyes of SpeelMan bloodshot and protruding through his skull. Chapter 16. The Entrance Hall. Robert had not interjected once and Mandix continued with the story. In the entrance hall, on a wide mirror server, was the Big Book of Evil Names. Near it posed a snake, its neck extended, and its head poised to strike. All those who entered the property through that side entrance would never be seen alive again. Mandix explained that at the top of the stairs, near the entrance to the staircase which descended to the basement, dangled the hands of a witch who had been decapitated. Her sin was trying to cast a spell on SpeelMan in order to gain his powers. SpeelMan bewitched her and banished her to the roof, with her hands dangling and dripping blood all year round. Chapter 17. The Zombie. High up in the galaxy was an evil zombie who chartered a metal carriage with spiky wheels to the moon. His eyes had been gouged out by SpeelMan. 3 housekeepers then chorused, and they vowed to make SpeelMan pay. They then masted commanding the spaceship to depart from and return to base. Next, they decided how the spoils would be distributed, once both SpeelMan and his wife had been contained. The head chef read up on the ability of witches to travel on brooms, on the back of baboons, as well as inside the hollowed-out loaves of bread. By the next day, the staff members discovered that because SpeelMan loved his afternoon tea, there was a prized tea set on a lonely wrought iron table in the middle of the forest. At 3 o'clock each afternoon, when there was thunder and lightning, the clanking of the teacups and saucers could be heard from a distance. Paintings of zombies adorned the basement walls. These zombies had had their tongues cut out, and the short remaining stumps which jutted out were swollen and necrosed. Chapter 18. The Broom, the Baboon and the Loaf. The 3 employees were formally inducted into the world of witchcraft, otherwise they would not have been able to cast certain spells. They inherited a snake each, one a broom, the other the baboon and the third a loaf of bread. Their levels of evil were so intense, they were banished by the villagers and occupied the haunted house deep in the forest. The witches would often abduct a child, and white napkins could be seen fluttering in the wind. Between the hours of midnight and 1 in the morning, they could be seen by the brave, flying off to the moon. However, the baboon became uncooperative and one day it was not in the mood to fly to the moon. The witches were so angry, they captured and confined it to a horror mask with protruding nails so that it would not escape. The baboon's ability to fly was also taken away permanently. Once a businessman was so greedy for material wealth, he had gone into the forest to pledge allegiance to the witches. He sacrificed his own mother and his favorite son. At first, he received all the material wealth he desired, built a business empire, and even had a castle built on a vast property. However, when he stopped paying dues to the witches and he no longer participated in rituals, he woke up to find that he had grown black devil's horns. Chapter 19. The Werewolf. A dog-like creature, whitish-gray in color, with seeping sores protruding from its thin hide, appeared that night. It pranced up and down, howling at the moon. The son of the housekeeper, who was one of the few black medical professionals from the area, was called to give an opinion. When he saw the animal, he immediately told his mother that it was a werewolf. He paged through the books on the table, discovering that they contained instructions on how to turn a human being into a werewolf, and another which dealt with the building of spaceships and contraptions which could defy gravity and travel to the moon. The doctor's pager went off and he used the opportunity to exit the basement with its focus on witchcraft, superstition, sorcery, and the dark things of the occult. The staff realized after his departure that the werewolf was SpeelMan's brother, whom he had had a violent altercation with. SpeelMan turned him into a werewolf and he ensured that the werewolf would not be able to transition back into a human being again. Chapter 20. Mandix had her doubts. Mandix insisted that these were nothing but tall tales which had grown in leaps and in bounds over the years. She told Robert that the witches were rumored to have discovered the formula to an eternal life and that they remain slim, young, and healthy to this day. They had only reached that status after they had sacrificed Spielman and his wife. The farm prospered and the employees of the estate continued to be well compensated. However, none of the witches were trusted or welcome outside of the forest, so they only become visible at night. In the lounge of the Spielman home remained a black cat, which was cute and exorcised of all evil. It sported a beautiful pink flower in its mouth, and it ensured that evil is limited to the haunted house in the forest. Chapter 21. Their vehicle had not moved. Before Mandix could conclude the story, they noticed that the clock had struck 12, meaning that they had lost 3.5 hours. The car's engine was off. On the right-hand side was Spielman's forest, and their vehicle was again facing in the direction of Somo from which they had initially come. Suddenly, in the sky, they noticed 3 witches riding off to the moon on a rose-gold, metallic locust. They could not do nor say anything further until 1 in the morning. At 1 minute after 1, the car's engine started with the key not even in the ignition. Robert sped off in the direction of East London. Both Nunu and Nuku were now fast asleep. When they arrived at home, the grandfather clock in their lounge struck 8 in the evening. Neither Robert nor Mandix could recall the long conversation they had had about Spielman's forest and the coven of witches. Nunu had a vague recollection, but she too recalled it as nothing but a bad dream. The only thing which was real was the cramps in her tummy. But that was nothing the pharmacist at John Forbes' pharmacy could not treat. One thing Nunu knew for sure was that Makazi must be part of some coven of witches, which preys on small children, so there was some truth to the fact that witches indeed do exist. Postscript. That then is the sordid tale of Spielman's forest. I vowed that one day, when I was all grown up, with children and grandchildren of my own, I would tell them about the 3 witches of Spielman's forest and the evil Mr. Spielman, who in the end, was paid back for the evil he had sowed. And the day I wrote that in my diary, I peered outside my bedroom window and noticed that the sky had turned a bluish hue, and I am almost certain, I saw a witch riding off to the moon on a broom. What is strange is that Sergeant Ageni told me that when the 3 witches checked for references to witches who travel on or inside loaves of bread in Spielman's volumes, they found no such reference. Be that as it may, it forms part of our oral history.